All right. Well, thanks everyone for being here. This is the Agency Leadership Series with SOTA, and we're joined by our partners at Kantata. For those of you that don't know Kantata, you'll probably recognize and remember the name MavenLink and or Kimball, both of them kind of leading platforms in the professional services automation space. So they joined forces last year and rebranded as Kantata. And so we're thrilled to have them as partners in this series. We'll have this is the first of three sessions that we'll have, another one in January and another one in February. We'll get back to that at the end of the session today. I'm thrilled to be joined today with Henry Daubrez from Dog Studio, Josh Goldblum from Blue Cadet, and Casper. Casper, I meant to ask how to pronounce your last name. I'm so sorry.
Kuipers.
Kuipers. Okay, yeah. So
Thank
it's
you.
as it looks. So Casper Kuipers from Your Majesty. We've all obviously been reading about and playing around with AI and machine learning tools, especially with the explosion recently of DALL-E 2, Midjourney, people playing around on Lensa, etc. So there's while this technology has been in place for a while, it's certainly spiked in the last 3 to 6 months. It is even, I think, in a lot of ways, penetrated the popular consciousness. I was at a friend's for dinner the other night, and he's a Shakespearean professor, and he's like, "Oh my God, have you heard about this thing called chat, GLT or blah, blah, whatever." He didn't know what it is. He's like, "All my professor friends are texting me and emailing me and going, 'We're done. We're finished.' Chat GPT is going to take us over." So I was amazed. This is probably one of the first times any technology that we work with in our space has been on a friend of mine's radar so quickly. So I think that is a testament to where we're at. So for today's conversation, I was interested in digging into how this technology is actually being used today. There's a lot of experimentation obviously going on, and we're in the early days of this. None of us on this call are futurists. I don't even think we pretend to be, but I'm really interested in kind of like clearing through at least some of either the hype, but also some of potentially the dire predictions, and or the overly optimistic predictions, to chat with people who've really been starting to utilize this technology, starting to think about it more deeply, and starting to assess what it really means for a creative business such as ours. So that's the intent of the conversation today. It's a huge topic. We're not gonna, we're not gonna be able to go too deep into any particular area, but my hope is that we get some of the key issues and topics out on the table, as well as for those of you that are just starting to dig into this area, get you some knowledge and areas to start looking at and playing around with. We will have if you have questions or comments along the way, feel free to use the chat pod or the Q&A pod within Zoom, and I'll try to monitor that. Lakai, I know your voice is shot a little bit, but if I'm missing any of those, feel free to just jump in and kind of nudge me so that we can get to those questions. So without further ado, I'm going to jump in, and I'm gonna avoid proper intros, and we're going to dive right into kind of our first questions, and I'll have you guys do light introductions of yourself as we get in. But the first place I wanted to start is just to set some context, is share a little bit about how you've been using AI, and machine learning technology within your agency, ideally on projects that if you're actually implementing them, or at least, some more significant experiments that you've been working on, and just give us a sense of what that looks like, so we can kind of be grounded on where you're coming at. And as part of that, just give a quick intro of kind of who you are, your agency, and where you're calling in from. So Casper, I'll start with you if you don't mind.
Sure, no worries. Hi, everyone. I'm Casper. I'm a partner and technical director at Your Majesty. And the ways we've been working with AI and machine learning so far has been various. We actually tried to create a product a couple of years ago, which was named iTrack. And the purpose of that product was to speed up predictive or speed up eye tracking studies, right? So if you had an image, you could quickly determine whether or not certain visual interesting elements would be in that image by using that. So that's a thing what we did, where we trained a lot of, the data sets with a lot of people and did some eye tracking studies, and then encoded that into a data set, and then use that to quickly spit out images to see what people liked, or at least were visually attracted to. That was a very practical sort of first introduction to machine learning, and not so much into like the current ones that are taking a lot of attention nowadays. But it was definitely for me a way to get into this whole sphere of machine learning and understanding really what's behind it. And ever since we've been playing around with this, and yeah, this year has been crazy as to what's happened. I think another very interesting example is what we did this year was to work with Armada, which is the label for people like Armin van Buuren. Armin van Buuren wanted to release a record which was dubbed Computers Take Over the World, and they thought, wouldn't it be awesome if we could create a campaign and a art piece with these new tools to really establish that feeling. And so we helped them, we consulted them through like, okay, how do you use these processes nowadays? So we gave them some tips and tricks, like how should you be using this? How do you work with prompts and all that type of stuff? So it's a really interesting experience to go through that. So I think those are the most practical ones that we've had. And of course, it sneaks in through all kinds of like small daily optimizations, like, when we're programming, it's Copilot, starting to get into our coding. We might ask ChatGPT for some good ideas here and there. So it's definitely sort of sneaking its way into like a little bit more subtly into our processes as well.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you, Casper. Henry, why don't you go ahead and do the same from the perspective of Dog Studio?
Yeah, of course. So my name is Henry. I'm CEO and head of design at Dog Studio. Now Dog Studio Depth since we joined Depth a few months ago. What has been interesting to us, I mean, me personally as a designer for the better part of last year, and as a company, as we are, I would say, much of an experiential studio. A lot of what we're doing is based on storytelling, right? Like just getting a right story to the users, to the visitors if it's physical. And we did notice, and the same as Casper in this case, we started using a lot of different tools to not only stretch the limits of what could be done, how can we get faster into production? How can we better prototype in the pitch process and use text to image tools to get a broader scope of what we can do, what we can achieve? How, and you mentioned it, Casper, how can we leverage ChatGPT to rework potentially some gaming mechanics we're putting together? It's interesting to have a sounding board. Lately, we've been looking into how to use text to image to generate a base, which in return for a different set of tools is going to end up creating a 3D model. So I would say there's endless possibilities. We start getting a lot of questions from clients who want to jump on board and try to understand better what it is or what it could be. And I think this kind of really interesting year was great for us to just take some distance as well, try different things, and try to be smart when it will come to take actual choices for production, like what does make sense, and avoid, like the whole hype bandwagon and just, put things out there just because we can. We try to be smart about what we're going to do with it, which is going to be tough, I think, because most likely we make some mistakes like pretty much everyone else. So yeah, so I would say different levels and different tools and a lot of potential so far.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you, Henry. How about you, Josh, at Blue Cadet?
Yeah. So Josh Goldblum, founder, CEO of Blue Cadet. We've actually been using AI in some of our projects for a couple of years now. We just rolled out a project for the MIT Museum, which is we do a lot of stuff in like physical environments. So we did one called Collaborative Poetry, where you could actually co-author a poem with an AI. So we worked with GPT-2, and then since MIT has a relationship with OpenAI, we got access early to GPT-3 and their API, and we actually have this thing where you write a line, it writes a line, and you get this like very intimate experience, actually collaborating creatively with an AI in a physical space. And it's got this sort of beautiful OLED curved enclosure. We have another one where you can actually draw like a smiley face with different expressions, and in real time, it runs through like a machine learning algorithm, and it actually shows like, okay, this is how the machine understands the expression and it'll actually, then we have this sort of like, it's kind of like a hologram. It's really like a multi-layered Pepper's ghost that shows how the neural network's working in real time. We did some projects for the Henry Ford Museum where we ran their collection through an AI. And you could kind of see how the machine understands their collection, creates these really weird sort of serendipitous like pathways through their collection. And then for like a very practical thing, we do a lot of camera vision in our projects, like knowing where people are in environments. But we added a little bit of a layer of actually intelligent recognition. So it would know like, okay, that's a person and that's a chair. And I can ignore that thing as a chair and not have to constantly like be prompting a chair to interact with me. So like we've been doing those things. We did like some crazy style transfer mirror where we trained a bunch of we trained a machine on like a bunch of like images of like Picasso, and then you could go up there and see yourself as a Picasso, or like that sort of like take on me mode where it looks like a pen and ink drawing, and print it out, jam out a GIF. And now like we're also just getting super pragmatic with it, looking at grabbing code snippets and trying to figure out how to create like try to use it as prompts for sort of our own creative work.
That's awesome. So I want to ask about, well, I'm going to have a quick question just as a follow-up to this. And then I want to chat very quickly about some of the kind of the core tools, algorithms, data sets that are out there. And we can go through that very quickly, but it was very enlightening for me to, beyond some of the headlines, to learn some of the players that are kind of behind the scenes right now. But before we jump into that, it sounds like, and you can kind of correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like so far the AI ML kind of tech has been used in many ways to enhance projects, or maybe introduce a different layer of functionality, or, provide additional inspiration. But at least in your experiment so far has not been used so much to, say, transplant other work. Or as we'll say, a big efficiency play. I mean, certainly, there's some efficiency to that. And we'll come back to this if it just doesn't need to be the be all end all, but I'm just curious, is that, Casper, is that correct? Like from your perspective, that so far the implementation of the technology has been more kind of enhancement and experiment on top of what you're doing, in less, we'll say less in the areas of kind of like automating and or supplanting routine tasks?
It's in some ways, as we are using, for example, Copilot when we're coding, it does enhance our efficiency, so automate some things in that way. But in most places, we kind of more use it. Okay, how can we bring this into our creative process? How can we jam with the machine learning with the AIs, right? So how can we explore new visual directions? There's a lot of things. It's sort of like I think with what Josh said about the poetry thing, right? So you put something in, you get something back. It's a very interesting interplay, and I think there's a lot to be discovered in that area. But I think it hasn't fully replaced any particular process yet, not yet. But who knows what comes? Who knows?
And we'll come back to that. Is that, Josh and Henry, would you generally agree, at least in terms of how you've used it right now, or no? Have you actually seen have you actually used the technology in a ways that really is say, significantly automating tasks and or, you know, supplanting kind of like routine tasks?
Josh, after you.
You know, we're kind of in the early days right now. We're definitely grabbing some like code snippets. We're testing. I mean, we just playing with the chat GPT, like saying like, okay, could it write a cover letter?
Right.
Answer is
Right.
like, not really. And like actually in some ways it's like it's a really fun thing to jam with, but it's also the sort of thing like I haven't yet figured out if it's going to make for better work or if it's just going to make for faster work for us. So it's like,
Yeah.
I don't like, in some ways it's like, if we start with an AI generated cover letter, I don't know if like editing that will get us to a better place than if we just started with our normal process, or even if we're like, you know, trying visual styles and playing with the AI, like I'd be afraid we'd end up getting some very mid-journey, I don't know, but not necessarily like the best output. So you know, we're kind of wading cautiously in those waters right now.
It could be the same. It's making me think of how, in a lot of ways, content management platforms have like, you know, standardized like a website design.
Exactly.
You could see like in a few years, it's like every website looks like it was Mid-Journey.
Yeah, like stable
generated in terms of visual style. But Henry, anything to add to that?
Yeah, and just to bounce on that, I saw this week some people were trying Midjourney to produce some UI work, and it was interesting because it was kind of a dribble sauce, right? Like it was everything which was wrong, like everything was purely graphic design was impossible to use, and this is where you can see the limit of, you know, people trying things which are pretty but which are not going to be at the end of the day something you can use. But so on the other side, it's kind of the same experience. I would say that it's not really you know, replacing anyone, I would say, but then indeed, as mentioned, it's kind of fast tracking the process. What's interesting as well is that we really, you know, people always say when you're discussing and or like dialoguing with an AI, whether it's ChatGPT because it's actually a chat, but also even Midjourney or whatever, there's really this kind of a back and forth, which is interesting. And what we did notice that it's not replacing anyone or anything, but it does empower people. It's not because you're not a designer per se that you have ideas. I think like taste is becoming like a big thing. So it's interesting to see people who have a different background who actually come up with things which are visually interesting or like visually relevant, while they didn't have the technical skills to do it themselves as designers, which is to us really interesting because then you open even more your process to a lot of people. So we see it more as an enabler today, and like Josh said, like I love trial and error, I love you know, trying things on the wall to see what sticks. Like for example, we try using ChatGPT to see what kind of prompt it would generate based on the story we had. And what was interesting is that was technically accurate, but that like just a soul. That's not, you need to go back to it and we manipulate, hey, do what you want because you have something clear in your mind. So this is where you see the limit of this as of now. You know, we see in the future, but
yeah, that's for sure.
May I add a small anecdote? Sorry.
Oh yeah, please go ahead.
Tomorrow we have in our office Secret Santa, and that means there will be gifts, there will be poems. The suspicion is that 80% of these poems are going to come out of ChatGPT.
Yeah, exactly. Everyone's like, I don't have time for the Secret Santa.
Yeah, their wedding speeches are going to get much easier, you know.
Toasts, holiday toasts. So there's good suggestions, everyone. Holiday toasts, wedding toasts, Christmas cards. Maybe you could really cut down on that time. Well, I want to just jump into like a practical aspect, and then we'll kind of start to zoom out again. But you know, and I don't know the mix of the audience right now in terms of you know, to what extent they have been playing around with these tools, tracking these tools. But let's just talk a little bit about some of the technologies that you've been using, you know, to play around with. And I think, you know, I think for most of you out there, you know about both OpenAI and Stable Diffusion as two of the kind of, we'll call them sort of parent entities that have been spinning out a number of data sets and algorithms. OpenAI is behind Chat GPT and in DALL-E, I think, right? Sorry, Stable Diffusion is DALL-E. I don't know what's underlying Midjourney. Is that one of is Stable Diffusion or OpenAI underlying Midjourney?
No, it's a different. They're a different entity as well.
Okay.
Midjourney started 3 months ago with different team, and they have different models. And I think at some point they were using Stable Diffusion in between version, but now their V4 is totally different. They train
Okay.
the model differently.
I wouldn't be surprised if they used Clip, but
Clip is another one. Okay, Clip
Yeah.
is Clip is another one. And for those of you on the call, if you're interested, we'll, when we send out a copy of this recording, we'll include links to some of the key kind of technology pieces. But I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about, and maybe you can mention, just a few bits in your process and how you've been playing with it. What are some of the tools and algorithms that you've been using? Where do they, how do you kind of stitch them? How do you stitch them together? For instance, like if you're playing with something in Midjourney and you want to try to, transform it in another software, or can maybe tell me a little bit more about the Google, Colab stuff in how that works. I don't need to go into great detail, but I'd be curious, and I'd also, as part of that, just curious of how are you finding the APIs so far? Have they been relatively easy, to work with and manipulate, or are you still feeling like there's, a steep learning curve in kind of getting this stuff to do anything custom? And Casper, maybe I'll start with you because you've got the tech background, but
Sure.
maybe just share a few of the thoughts on, how you're bringing a couple of these different, tools into the mix and what they do for you.
Yeah, so I think what's for me particularly interesting, right? So you have a couple of these different tools. There's different ways of interacting with them. You have in your OpenAI, it's a lot more over APIs, so really like REST API calls. You exchange information over the internet, or you have the application which you have access to, which you have to pay for. For GPT, for DALL-E, and for GPT, you need to have access to that. It's kind of closed source, and the same is for Midjourney. In my experience, it's also closed source. But what's interesting, for example, they did open up Clip, which is part of the text to image. It's a neural network that OpenAI opened up, and also Stable Diffusion released their model earlier in the year. And that model was for all those images that you see created nowadays is probably largely Stable Diffusion, because it's really easy to flow that into whatever project you want to use it into. Whereas with DALL-E and with Midjourney, it was really much harder because you don't have the same level of access.
Right.
So it's been really interesting, and then a bunch of people in the open source scene have been working on like these little notebooks in which you can interact with these Google Colab things that you refer to, which is maybe a bit technical, but with a little bit of guidance, it's rather easy to get going. You don't need to know Python from inside and outside. You don't need to know machine learning from inside and outside. You just need to know what fields you need to fill in and click, and hopefully it runs and you get an output. So what was really interesting, I was working with a colleague of mine who's not so technical. She was really interested in, okay, how can I work with this? And somebody made like a notebook for making animations with Stable Diffusion. So you have these frames that transform. And I sat with her for 2 hours, and the next day she puts on Instagram, a couple of these videos, and that's just great. Like the learning curve is not that high to get started. Of course, if you want to understand machine learning and how to train data and that type of stuff, it's much further to go. But it's the threshold accessibility is quite small at the moment.
I mean, that's an interesting too, just to add on, and Josh or Henry, you can jump in on this, but if any of you, started to train your own data, or have you been mostly just using, API calls to the data that exists? Or another portion of that is like, do you see yourself starting to write algorithms on top of the algorithms that exist so that, you're making something that's more specific or, unique to the, to the way that you work? And again, I know this is early days, but just curious about some of those practical matters, at least right now. Josh?
I'll just be honest. My development day is dropped off for an ActionScript 3.
Yeah.
Which I was great. But you know, I kind of talked to my tech team about this a little bit and be like, what do you guys, you know, how are we doing this? I mean, they were talking about Python, then read a bunch of acronyms that I just kind of like blanked on. So I, rather than like trying to paraphrase that and ruining, like sending people in the wrong direction, I'm gonna respectfully pass on that question.
No problem. But how about for you, Henry, if you have any insight to this, particularly in your dev team, in terms of like how they're working with it, and, you know, are they, you know, are you starting to see this layer of need, like on basically on top of the API calls, that you can get all this great stuff, but that you're needing to create either, you know, train data models on your own?
Oh, wait, actually, you know what? I can totally answer some of that though.
Okay.
Go ahead. I'll circle back.
Go ahead, Henry.
I actually do have a good antidote.
Okay, good. Oh, Henry, I think you're on mute.
I can be pretty short anyway. As of today, we didn't have an actual need to train models or whatever, because we didn't, you know, use any of this really in production. But then turns out that one of the big topics, and I saw a question on this on the chat, but like that's directly related, is how the models are trained and how important it is, and where the data comes from, and what is the copyright on this. And so I know, for example, Stable Diffusion on their new version can actually clean their act as the open source. I guess which is logical, and didn't want to be exposed when it comes to copyrighted materials. So they took out a lot of this in the way they were building the model. And then people can customize the way they want. If they want to add their own model, it's their right. But so I think that's a lot of the ethical questions which are answered right now are linked to how we're going to do this in the future. And definitely, we will need to train our own models with data we know is for sure something we own the rights for. We already see some industries which are being disrupted on the front, like video game, for example, where some companies are already working into processes in which you train your own models, and then you can, based on data you have, basically artists who are working already with you, I guess disclaimers, whatever, they will have to sign for that, waivers, but to generate faster, more assets which are going to be used in production. And this is the workflow which we see most likely happening in a really short term. So we don't, but we know that for client work, we definitely will need to, because that's where it is.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, go ahead, Josh.
Oh, no, I was going to mention when we're talking about training models. So for that project that we did for MIT, where you could basically recognize the different sort of like smiley face expressions, we built this like little web app where basically people go in there and create, like, basically draw their expression and then sync it to like what they'd be like, do something surprise, and you draw a surprise thing, draw something happy, draw happy, and like it was like a little web app, you know, and we basically pushed it out to our network. We pushed out, you know, all, like we like trained, I think, you know, a couple thousand of these smiley faces, but that's how we use that as the basis then for that experience.
Yeah.
Cool. And yeah, I think I'm gonna drop an article about that next week.
Okay.
And so we got some pretty fun art, like there's some pretty like fun documentation of it, but like, again, like that was us kind of like figuring out like, okay, how do you actually train this model to do this like very specific interaction? Right.
So that's a good segue into, you know, I want to talk a little bit about, you know, how, at least now where you're at, what kind of changes you're anticipating to either workflow, your creative workflow and your kind of creative development process, and maybe there are none, you know, and or how you're looking at skills development kind of within your teams. So, you know, where we stand today, and you know, you guys have all now done projects with this stuff. I mean, first of all, how has that, you know, as you bring in AI and machine learning is almost like a partner, a thought partner, or another tool in the workflow. Has that changed your creative workflow at all? And if not, you know, do you anticipate that? Like, do you see some need for that in the future? But kind of same thing around skills development, or do you think that for the most part, it's like, you know, an engineer can learn like the new things that, you know, that they need to learn, that it's not, you know, it's not a whole, you know, it's not an entirely different skill set that we're, you know, required to take advantage of this. So Casper, I can start with you on that front.
Sure. So I think on the latter part of the question, I think there's sort of two layers to it, right? So as I mentioned earlier, some of this stuff is a lot easier to access. And you don't have to be super technical. It's helpful if you know a little bit of programming and you know how to navigate the internet. But you can get a lot done working with Stable Diffusion, working with these notebooks that people create in the open source world. Now, if you want to go deeper, right? If you want to go start training your own stuff or start changing the neural networks or make your own adaptations thereof, then there's a shift, of course. Then you need very technical skills to do that.
Yeah.
Other skills, of course, it could be interesting to explore. How does one express a visual representation of things, right? So like the whole thing around what some people call promptism is like the ability to write a good prompt could be a skill. Changes who is an art director or not. Could change who's an art director or not.
Interesting.
Now going to the creative processes in our end, I think we're going to look at opportunities where we can sort of bring this into a process. We're going to look at opportunities where this could, trigger us with new thoughts and those type of things. I've seen a lot of interesting people working with workflows that they bring a part of the image generation piece, for example, into a 3D world or into connected it with, I guess the guys at Modem, connected to the open, how you call it? Synthesizer thing, Teenage Engineering, right? So they made a toy in which you could play music with and you get images out of it. So there's a lot of exploration still to be done.
Yeah, for sure. How about you, Henry, in terms of just any short-term observations and impact you've seen on either skills required or kind of different ways of working that this technology is introducing?
So I would say on our side, it's more of a pre-production accelerator, getting visual ideas quickly on the table versus having. It's good to start with a sketch, but it's good to have things which you can look at and with a certain level of detail already, which normally you wouldn't spend money for at that phase of the project. To come back on what Casper said about the prompt, that's interesting because now, so the team at some point asked to have a Midjourney account so that they could try on their side. And what I did notice after spending, now more than a year, and going from different tools, there's not Midjourney, but like we spoke about the Collab notebooks before, playing with prompts, what's interesting is that even if it's a skill, it's something that indeed you have to learn, but then it's an absolute. Each tool is going to react differently. People keep on discovering new elements, how to use punctuation, which is going to influence the result. Some are really minimalist and just in a few words come up with something which is nice. Some are maximalist and put things like this, which at the end of the day are not even recognized, so there's no point. But so I do notice that I tend to now help the team with that when they start bringing things up like, oh, seeing the result, you can use this and this and that, and maybe you can take this out. But also what's funny is that I think it's something you can teach, but something which is also about being able to keep on learning and iterating, because once again, different tools, different results. Stable Diffusion 1, 2, and 1.5, when it switched to 2, totally different database, model, everything, and then new ways to work. So people have to put everything to garbage and start again. Yeah. And it seems like it's going to be like this for a while. So I think being resilient is going to be a new tool with all of that, being able to adapt to all those constantly changing technologies at that speed. And then there was one more thing. What is it? I don't come back on it. It's fine.
No problem. Yeah. How about you, Josh? And I have I
would say, like a lot of the Blue Cadet work that we do is about like taking like very, very like complex information and trying to make it like accessible, or also like, we also do like some of these like large like institutional websites and stuff like that, right. Or we're like do like the National World War II Museum's website. So like if you like the thing is like if you wanted to like have an interface into like answering questions about World War II, or for it to prompt things back to you or give it to you. Like in some ways, like that chat interface, like the types of like chat bots that you could create, or the type of way that you could access that content is going to be so much more powerful with this like chat AI than any of the tools have been available before. So like when I'm looking at it, I'm all, obviously we're looking at it through like the creative workflow process, but we're also looking at it like, okay, how do we solve client problems with this?
Right.
And I think there's a lot of opportunity. I think there's like a ton of opportunity there, particularly on the sort of the chat UX
Yeah.
side of things. So I'm super interested in that. And then when we talk about sort of like the craft of like prompts and stuff like that, I'd say like get a Midjourney account. It's not that expensive. And then also like there are all these like Discord channels like for Midjourney where you can actually see how people do their prompts, and there's like a community of creators there. So I would say like it's a great place to jump in, and like anybody can kind of get on ramped in that space.
I mean, it's really interesting, and Ben, Ben commented in the chat, and Ben, I don't know if if you were referring to this bit. So if you weren't, you can go ahead and comment again, but, suggesting maybe that, the talent of writing good prompts may also be really limited, because as the AIs get smarter, they'll get better and better at quality, at quality output with, in some ways less and less maybe. But one thing that raises for me is that, the issue of communication exists and has always existed with language or images, that there's never a perfect representation of an idea in language, and there's never a perfect representation of an idea in images. So we've played with with languages for thousands of years, and yet we still write books that express things differently. And that's not to say that, AI won't write books, but it's to say that based on any given prompt, I'm not sure that the output you're looking for is going to be prescribed, and so it gets to this notion of, creativity and prompts also has to do with, your ability to express what you're looking for. And you may not even know what you're looking for. So I do think that notion of prompting, at least from my perspective, still seems to, it's important in human dialogue today, thousands of years later. And so I don't see how it wouldn't be critical in human to machine dialogue, as we, still struggle to either speak the words that we mean, or create the images or the things that are expressing, something that's difficult to express.
To build on that, I think there's also a lot in happy accidents. There's something interesting in the fact that we don't control fully the process. Sometimes you're going to be returned something you didn't expect, which is actually at the end of the day better. But it's also, I like to say that when you use any kind of text to image or whatever, like text something, there's a part which is logics, where you can build with just keywords are going to create something. But there's a part which is kind of jazz, right? Like you have to improvise, you have to try, you have to. And then you're going to be surprised, and then you're going to pick an information. So earlier I mentioned the sounding board. I think there's a lot of ways right now, and hopefully it's going to be doing the same. You need a human point of view on that to be able to make sense out of it. Generating 600 images could all be bad taste, for all we know, because and it's the choices you make at the end of the day which are going to make a difference.
Yeah, I was.
Oh, good. No, go ahead, Josh.
Yeah, no. The other thing I was going to say is, I think that. One of the things I realized, like when I was sort of like testing this like collaborative poetry thing, is that like, like when you first do it, you're like, oh yeah, I'm going to see how this thing works. Like what can it do? Or like when you're doing ChatGPT-3, like what's it capable of? And you're like kind of kicking the tires in the tool. But what I found actually in the poetry thing, like once you kind of got back past like, okay, how does it work? And you actually start like actually collaborating with it, like it's an amazing companion. And it's actually a very like beautiful human thing that like I'm not going to write any poems with my friends or family, honestly. Like it's like I'm not like secure enough for that level of intimacy. But like I can do that with an AI, and like the same thing with like creating with these like visual chat to image ones. It's like, you can like play with it and you kind of kick the tires, but like then when you like kind of get past that, be like, okay, like let me just actually like get in this intimate space where I'm like co-creating with it, and like expressing myself, like that's where it gets like much more deep and much more interesting to me.
Yeah.
And I think people are going to spend a lot of time, like very intimate time with these AIs. Like I think
Right.
that movie Her is like super prescient. I think people are going to like fall in love with these things.
Yeah. I mean, certainly like you said, the barriers to intimacy are much, much lower in a lot of ways.
Oh yeah, it's not going to judge you. It might
Judgment,
scrape all your
judgment,
data.
shame, fear, etc. And I think what you're telling me is they're a lot easier to work with than like a moody, judgmental creative director too.
Yeah, anybody I know.
No, well, I want to
easier to work with than me.
Yeah, true. Than any of us, really, right? But I want to jump back to, Henry, because we talked about this a little bit last week. And this gets in a little bit to sort of how it changes your role as creators, or if not even changes, just evolves it, enhances it, and Henry, we talked a little bit about just, the greater importance of style and curation and really sort of understanding what's, one, what your vision is, but two, kind of what's going to be effective, because to your point, it's like, Casper, we talked about this a little bit too. In some ways, it becomes very overwhelming really quickly. It's like, oh, wow, now we just generated 600 options for this concept. Like, which one is good? Which one's good? Which one's the right one? Where should we take it? So Henry, maybe I'd like you to start with you on that and we'll rotate it around, but
yeah.
And you don't have to comment on that piece specifically, but, just general thoughts on, I think this, it's new power for creators, but it also, I think it introduces new challenges too.
So, yeah, I would say, so what's interesting for me as a background is that I've been doing creative direction for like so long. And this process is familiar, right? You're going to see a design, you're going to have a point of view on it, you're going to say like, maybe this should be like this, it should be like that. And it's a way to see this at scale. So often when you present it with many options, what's difficult is to choose, right? And I did mention before, and I'm really convinced that the upcoming era is going to be a lot about taste, at least for everything which is visual. Having the power and having this kind of a capacity to build or like to create images which are visually or like aesthetically, technically perfect. Like if an artist would have spent, weeks working on this with the best tools and the best anatomic knowledge, that doesn't mean the image in itself is interesting as a point of view, has any kind of use. So of course, if you create this as an artist and it's for yourself, it should please yourself first. I think that's a lot of what's happening. But then once those tools are going to get to be more mainstream into communication and into our jobs, I guess it's going to be important to know indeed what kind of point of view you have. And so, yeah, being able to curate, being able to understand, being able to direct is, to me, key. What's interesting, and you mentioned it before, is how, and maybe at some point we'll be everything the same solution, but how those tools can be interfaced right now. So if I look personally at how I work, I'm going to use Stable Diffusion to generate some parts, and then, or let's say a typical process could be you do Midjourney to create a first version, and then you're going to use DALL-E to do outpainting to actually extend the frame what you have. Then you're going to reuse Stable Diffusion to regenerate parts you don't like, but that's upscale. And then you can go to solutions like Gigapixel from Topaz to upscale again. But so, or you're going to Photoshop in between. So it's interesting how there's no solution which is going to do everything right now, or at least as of today. But also how it's to me an open door to actually mix and match stuff and get your own very specific vision on the table by actually using all of this versus saying like, oh, I'll generate this on Midjourney and that's definite and that's that's what you get, because then it comes lacking quite often.
Yeah, I mean, it's not, it's not unlike any artist who works with material, like existing materials, existing processes, existing tools, but combining them in unique and novel and personal ways that express kind of the vision the vision or the novelty that they're looking for. And I think that's certainly something that misses, in any one kind of tool right now. Obviously that will continue to change, but Josh, why don't we go to you, and then Casper, just kind of same thought process of just, how it stretches your role as a creator.
I mean, I think Henry is like totally right about like point of view and intent. It's like, yeah, the thing is, like, you could put something in Midjourney, you could put something in there, and it'll generate something like aesthetically pretty or interesting.
Right.
But like doesn't matter. Like, what does it say? Like, why did like there a there, and often no. I mean, maybe you can interpret it, but it doesn't necessarily express your artistic intent. So, I'm very interested in like, yeah, how do you use this as a tool? How do you use it in a way that is trying to like deliver information or doing something political, like moves it beyond just creating an aesthetic artifact. But then, at the end of the day, there's a big market for aesthetic artifacts. So if you're like doing like stock imagery or stock photography or just like all that crap noise out there, like it's going to disrupt and displace a lot of that stuff. I mean, the same way that like portrait painting and still lifes were pretty disrupted by the advent of photography. Like, this is going to disrupt a whole tier of creative production, but it's going to allow for this whole other tier of creative production to come in its own. So I'm very interested in sort of orienting towards the new and not really worrying about what's going to get kind of like commoditized.
Yeah, absolutely. How about you, Casper? Any thoughts to add to to that? Is and you're coming at it from a technical perspective too, but just how it stretches and challenges, maybe concerns you as a technical leader.
Yeah, so a couple of things. I think what Josh and Henry are saying, I'm also aligning with, right? So it's the curation, being able to have taste and be able to determine what is interesting, what is important. Ultimately, this is a tool in the toolbox that you can use to maybe make specific outputs for. You can put it in your workflow and build on it. You can use it as patchwork. I've seen people using different types of AIs to get to certain results, just combining a couple of pieces of outputs and expanding on it. So there's a lot to be explored there. And I think when Ben mentioned, I think that point around what if it gets too good, right, and it gets too easy. And I think that's an interesting one, because what I've worried a little bit as a technical person, there is a lot of interesting artifacts in the earlier releases. And I'm wondering if we're rushing by that and trying to be, the guys that are making these models now, trying to make it too perfect. And there's no people with 6 fingers anymore, or like 3 or merged hands and this type of things.
Yeah.
Not that that is particularly interesting, but there's a lot of interesting maybe things to be explored that's hiding in that data model in the latent space. And I think there's also a lot of actually creativity to be found. There's like people that call themselves latent space navigators. There's so much going on in that space that you could find really interesting results out of. So that was maybe a more technical answer to that, but
yeah.
I think there is a lot more to be explored besides perfect results. That's I guess the short story.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, it comes back to Henry kind of citing the happy accident, and that has always been sort of a fundamental aspect of discovery in a lot of ways, right? Discovery and creation and invention is the imperfect created a whole new idea or genre or thing. So I want a couple practical matters, because they've come up in the chat thread, and I do want to address those, and then you've got about 10 more minutes, and then we'll zoom out for some final thoughts. But there's both the aspect of, and we touched on this, Henry, you touched on this particularly in training your own models, but obviously the notion of kind of artists' rights and creators' rights is going to be a big challenge, and it's sort of like, in some ways the AI is only as good as the data it has and gets trained on. But if all that data were proprietary or owned, by people, artists, creators, like how smart could the AI really get? So I'd be curious on some thoughts on just, mediating that, the idea of, in some ways, creative IP. And I'm going to just throw this in here just for efficiency. It's not the same question, but somewhat related. And I think you guys are already saying this, but, do you think that with where AI tools are at right now, and certainly where we can anticipate them going in the next couple of years, that it's going to force, agencies and, creative leads to, produce, actually defensible, good differentiated work that's not just a commodity, right? Because it's easy to phone it in on certain things, and obviously there's lots of mediocre work out on the web right now, and it seems to me that a lot of that work is at risk, of getting automated away, where the novelty of the work is not entirely, or the conceptual strength of the work is not entirely strong. And then on the flip side, we talked about curation. The person who's curating it could be the client, their level of curation is not that high.
Mm-hmm.
And so that kind of leads to, it's like, well, automated is good enough, right? And so it seems like there should be a set of the creative community that's concerned about that. So anyway, Henry, maybe you start with that. I know you can address either
Yep.
and or both of those.
I think there's a few things. That what's interesting is I mean, we see down the road, but like it looks like there will be different opportunities. If the clients have access to those tools and can generate the visual, once again, doesn't mean they're going to generate anything interesting. So you, as an agency, can come as a gatekeeper to actually ensure that you produce something just a point of view. So you have the understanding of the tool, the understanding what's expected. When it comes to artists, indeed, it's really a tricky one because, I mean, there's no way around it with the current progress of the AI, and there's still a few quirks, but that goes really fast. I wouldn't say that's the point. I don't think they're being made irrelevant, but then their contribution is going to be different in a lot of industries. And I know as an artist, it's complicated already to make a living. If you look at video game, it's already a problem that a lot of them are not, paid to what they actually could get. But then on the flip side, looking at this training of model, we can definitely imagine the future companies hiring artists to actually build the material which can be used to train the model, and then use the model in return to scale up. Because there's something that you cannot go around, is that an artist cannot produce that many assets in a short amount of time. So I think there's an interest maybe in that front, but I mean, let's be honest, it's likely that it's still going to reduce the headcount. Like you don't need like 60 artists if 10 can own the style and produce enough to train the models. But there's still a way in there, most likely others. What I like to see, and having myself worked or like experimented on the art side with the AI assisted creation for last year, is people coming from a traditional background who actually, instead of complaining about it, are embracing it and start to transform the entire process. Easier generate things that you're going to print in return and then remodify physically with the full paint, or use it as a conversation starter, or like just a lot of different ways. But a lot of the best advocates in the AI art, from what I see, actually come from a traditional background. So it's not, like, it's still pretty polarizing, but I see a future where this can be integrated as just a different tool. And it's difficult to see right now because indeed a lot of industries are going to be disrupted, but there's still potential in there, I think.
Yeah, for sure.
How about you, Josh? You want to add to
Sure,
that? Sorry,
sure.
I'm typing a couple responses in the chat.
Yeah. I mean, I've had a lot of these conversations recently, and I think we're sort of like in the Napster era of AI. like we all remember that time where like, oh my God, like music is free, like it's all like it's like I'll be able to own anything, blah blah blah, and like that era lasted for a very short period of time. So like I think that like this idea that like we're just gonna rip off every like contemporary artist and just like take their style and remaster it and put out our own books, it's not gonna happen. Like like the idea that you're gonna be like no one's gonna be like, oh, I'm gonna do a whole bunch of like Metallica cover albums, for and like I'm gonna make a mint on it. Like Metallica's coming after you. So it's like I'm not worried about like capitalism protecting itself.
And you don't want Lars. You don't want Lars coming after you. I'm just telling you.
I guarantee you that like they're like there will be barriers to that. But the other thing is like, I like going back to that photo analogy, like if you're in the 1800s and photography just started, like you could not predict film. You could not predict HBO. Like, I think this is as disruptive a technology. And like, if you're talking about like what the hell this is going to be, it's like going to be this like crazy open metaverse, real time, like that No Man's Sky video game where you can travel around and like worlds are generated on the fly and all this crazy shit that we can barely imagine right now. Like that's what this is opening up. So like, I don't think we need to like be too worried about protecting our like websites. Okay, like Squarespace has taken enough of a bite of that. Like we got to be focused on what are the possibilities this is going to open up.
Yeah, I mean, I love that, Josh, and just to pick up on that, because I think, we don't know what kind of economy this is going to spur 10, 20, 30, 40 years, from now. So, roles for creators may change, but I mean, undoubtedly there will be roles for creators.
Gotta ride the wave.
And yeah. How about you, Casper? You want to add to that thought? And I think we can move into just a couple, and I'll come back to you, Henry, on this. So, Josh, I guess I'll summarize that for you. So I was going to ask, I see you're just, where do you put yourself on the spectrum? Optimist, pragmatist, skeptic, just in terms of where we're at and what you expect to see in the next few years.
Pragmatic optimist.
Yeah. So you're not, it's going to be what it's going to be. You're not fretting too much around how it's going to remake the marketplace.
I was a Flash developer. I know.
Yeah.
Like I know how this goes.
Yeah. I mean, you look at how you're using your ActionScript 3 skills right now,
Totally.
How about you, Casper, just on this kind of spectrum of?
Yeah, I would say I'm definitely optimistic, maybe with some caution. The licensing problem is interesting on the short term.
Yeah.
I think it's also there's some opportunities there. I think if you would be able to create a licensing model like music or whatever, like you could sell, as an artist, sell a piece of your data, and a company can use it for something and train their own models with. That's maybe an opportunity to do that. Like it's like creating samples for musicians.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if it's the best analogy there, but I think there's definitely an opportunity for licensing there, and it will come in one shape or form.
Yeah.
The results are only as good as your training data in the end. So you'll need to get that training data, and somebody needs to be able to provide you that. A lot of it is in the public domain, but not everything will remain in the public domain.
Right. Exactly. And Henry, go ahead, Casper. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, just quickly, I do wonder, like you said, Josh, the websites will write themselves, I think, eventually, and I'm waiting for Squarespace to come with their fully AI prompt based website generator, and we're done.
Exactly.
That line of business is done for sure.
Yeah.
It'll no longer be the square. It won't be a square. It'll be an infinity symbol, and then we know when they change their brand logo to that, then we know the end is near. How about you, Henry? And we'll close with that. But you're a practicing artist too. So I'm just curious, optimistic, skeptic, pragmatist, cautious, just as you kind of look at, we're not looking deep into the future, but just, where you're at with these next couple of years and leveraging this technology.
I mean, it's complicated. It's pretty much ambivalent right now. There's a part of me which is really excited about that. Like I went back to actually creating stuff which I left quite a few years ago because work is number one, but then this drive at some point is kind of gone. It's good to be able to have this kind of impulse once again to create and to try and to experiment, and it's something I really appreciate. But then indeed on the flip side, pretty cautious because there's a lot happening, and then the legal frame around it is really blurry. And yeah, as you mentioned before, I like this linked with Napster. It's, you know, this kind of oh, everything's possible, and then a frame is going to round it, and then yeah, it's going to make sense eventually. But right now, it's kind of a Far West. And yeah, so really curious, and to build something which has been said before. I'm wondering when artists will be able to get a big check to train models, because in return companies are going to make a lot of money on the back of those models.
That's
But
interesting.
so maybe it's a chance for them to get 10 years worth of money in one single shot, versus having to grind every single day of their life. So there might be something in there.
That's interesting. So it's like an artist as a like a personal trainer for an AI, you know?
Yeah, and then there's a whole conversation about Web3 too, you know, that'll dovetail onto this stuff. So
well, we'll save that for another day. But thank you guys so much. This has been a great conversation, and we'll keep it going for sure within the SOTA community. And Ivan had mentioned in the chat thread about getting a worksheet going where we're sharing at least some of the tools that people are discovering, using, and all of that. I think that'd be great to do. I'm going to do just a quick screen share for those still on. I want to let you know about our upcoming event. But first of all, thank you to these guys. It's a great discussion. Check Dog Studio, Blue Cadet, Your Majesty. Check them out online too if you're interested. They're often publishing some of the work that they're doing in this area, so you can track it that way. I mentioned earlier, so this is part of a 3-part series that we're doing with Kantata. So we'll have another session at the end of January where we're going to look at the economic outlook for the year ahead, and we'll have some good data coming in from SOTA's Global Digital Outlook Study at that time to facilitate that conversation. And then in February, we're going to have a conversation really around kind of the agency financial model and selling time for money, and is our approach to kind of selling pricing creativity broken, and certainly the way things like AI play into this could, argue for, continued shifts in how we look at using human capital, human creativity, and, how we sell and price that. Last thing, if you're interested, Kantata, our friends, are also always posting interesting and useful thought leadership, particularly on the ops side. So if you're looking for some inspiration, new ideas, or just provocations, a couple of things they've released recently, trends on driving resource management and automation, blog posts that they've recently put out there. And then a podcast on how to get the best out of your client relationships. So you can search around on Kantata.com and find that. Thanks everyone for joining today. It's a webinar, so I couldn't see you, and I hate that, but I hope you're all doing well and heading into a smooth sailing for the year end. And if we don't see you, happy holidays to you all. Thanks again to our speakers, and thanks to Kantata for joining us today. We appreciate it.